being here. Hopefully it stays a little drier than we thought. It's great to hear of UVA's work with the Environmental Resilience Institute. I think there's no more timely period in our history for this focus on resilience. During my years in the McAuliffe administration, it was a pretty significant area of focus, and Governor Northam has really elevated resilience in his administration. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing across the spectrum as it relates to energy policy, maybe weaving in a little bit of those resilience themes, especially as we're facing a major hurricane and lots of new challenges, resilience-related challenges that deal both with environmental and other factors that could potentially impact the energy space going forward. So I have a couple notes. I really would like this to be a bit more free-flowing. I'd like to leave some time for Q&A at the end. I know Ken German with DMME is going to be giving a presentation after me, so he certainly has a lot of expertise on the solar side of the equation as well, and he can answer a lot of those questions, but from more of a high-level policy perspective, I'm happy to answer any questions. So the way that we're looking at energy policy is from a variety of angles. The first of which I think would be helpful for you guys to understand, is that we are going through a comprehensive energy planning process right now. And this is something that's actually required of every administration in the first year of their term to basically do a review of our energy system. There's a lot of information provided in code that we need to look at, but we have decided that we're going to spend a bit more time focusing on a couple of specific areas that we think have a lot of momentum, a lot of technological advances, and are things that we'd like to see really move forward and thrive under this administration. So we focused on 5 particular stakeholder tracks. We've been meeting through the summer. Beth Major, who's with our Department of Environmental Quality, she manages our permit by rule process. She's been at some of those meetings, but gosh, we've had at least 24 meetings through the summer on each of these stakeholder tracks. So they follow 5 different core subject areas around energy. Energy efficiency, which of course was a very significant area of focus in the previous administration, but is an area where we're still really not on track in terms of where we need to be. And so we'd really like to redouble our efforts on energy efficiency. I won't spend a lot of time today talking about EE, but I'm happy to answer questions after my remarks on that. Offshore wind. So there's a tremendous amount of movement right now on offshore wind up and down the East Coast. In Virginia, the governor was just out at the port a couple of weeks ago announcing that Dominion has finally filed for approval for the demonstration project, which is a 12 megawatt offshore wind pilot project located off the coast of Virginia Beach, and that will be the first offshore wind project in the mid-Atlantic. We're hopeful that completion of that project will occur by the end of 2020. And really what that project is it's looking at the feasibility of offshore wind off the Virginia coast. We have some, I think, unique attributes in terms of the most significant port infrastructure on the East Coast, but then we also have some other competing interests, like the largest naval station in the world. And so the Department of Defense is really interested in understanding the interaction between these offshore wind resources and their facilities, their fleets. So this project will, we hope, alleviate some of the concerns that those competing interests have had over offshore wind, and will really propel us forward as we begin to develop the full scale. We have right now a larger tract, it's 112,000 acres, that can support at least 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So that's another very significant, promising area for us. A third area of focus is looking at specifically onshore wind and solar energy. And we focused on some language that was provided in a piece of legislation that passed this session, Senate Bill 966. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. It's called the Grid Transformation and Security Act, but that legislation included language about stakeholder involvement relative to 4 key subject areas. And these are subject areas that really have come before our General Assembly a number of times over the last few years. So there's just been a heightened level of discussion and conversation about how we move the ball forward on those particular subjects. So the first is net metering. Net metering, I think we all understand what that program is, but there have been a lot of questions about caps and limits associated with the net metering program, and then more generally, the payment structure. So how is solar valued under our current net metering structure, and how should solar be valued going forward? So there was a really significant and robust stakeholder discussion around both the caps and the limits associated with the net metering program, and then also what process or what formula shall we utilize to evaluate the value of the solar resource going forward. And so those are some of the questions that we'll be looking at as part of our energy plan. A second question is community solar. So we have a community solar pilot program that was put in place via legislation a couple of years ago. Dominion has filed an application for approval with the State Corporation Commission for that program, so we're still kind of in the preliminary process of understanding exactly what that program is going to mean for customers who may want to purchase solar from facilities that are located off-site, but still want to have the solar attributes for their own home or business. And we think this is obviously a very important program. It provides for equity, but it also provides customers with stability over the long term if they want to have access to a reasonable rate structure for solar facilities. A third area of focus is corporate procurement. So we have had a tremendous amount of growth of solar over the last couple of years, but the bulk of that growth has come from large utility scale installations, the output of which is being purchased by very large companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook. Just to give you guys an order of scale, those three companies alone, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook, will be responsible for nearly 1 gigawatt of solar investment in Virginia over the next couple of years. Much of that installation has already occurred. Some of it is still pending. For example, there's a very large solar facility in Spotsylvania County that's just going through the permitting process for Microsoft. Microsoft will be purchasing about 315 megawatts of output from that 500 megawatt facility. But there's a significant amount of movement in terms of corporate procurement. And a lot of this is being driven by large companies that have corporate sustainability targets and are looking at locating in places like Virginia that have options available to them. But we've heard from other companies, maybe smaller companies, that don't have that same capacity need, that don't need 100 or 200 megawatts of solar. How do they still get in the door and reach their corporate sustainability targets? And so those are some of the questions that have been discussed as part of the stakeholder process through the energy plan. Questions around aggregation, whether multiple customers can purchase solar from one particular facility, and what types of tariff structures are available for corporate customers that want to take advantage of benefits of renewable energy, either from their own corporate procurement perspective or because they just see a long-term value associated with the resource. And then the fourth area of focus is local siting. And so I'm sure I know we have a number of developers in the room who understand that most of the decisions relative to whether a solar facility gets built actually occur at the local level via zoning and comprehensive planning processes. And so we've heard from some local governments that they'd like more resources provided by the state to understand what the impact of these solar facilities will be for them. There are questions around our tax structure. There are questions around environmental impacts. As I mentioned, Beth Major with the Department of Environmental Quality oversees our permit by rule process, and so that process is really aimed at looking at a lot of the environmental impacts from the state regulatory perspective, but there are a lot of issues that the local governments also have to deal with on their own. So we've been having conversations with a lot of local governments, developers, other interested stakeholders about maybe some toolkits or other resources that we can provide at the state level to help overcome some of those barriers associated with the deployment of a large amount of solar that we expect to be deployed over the coming years. So let me take a step back and just talk a little bit about the Grid Transformation and Security Act, because I think that provides kind of the overarching nexus for a lot of these conversations that we're having, especially as it relates to our development of our energy plan process. So the legislation was passed this session. The governor signed it in March. It became law on July 1st. And it provides for a lot of things. It's a massive piece of legislation, but as it relates to clean energy, there are a couple of specific provisions that I think just might be helpful for me to provide a little bit of detail on, and then of course we'll see how it plays out over the coming years. But we have some specific language in the law, and it's been there for other types of resources that deems a particular asset to be in the public interest. And what this means is when our State Corporation Commission, which is our utility commission, does a review of whether or not a utility is going to be able to make investments in a particular generation resource going forward, they look at it from a couple of different lenses. The first lens is whether that resource is in the public interest, whether it is something that would be beneficial to ratepayers writ large. And then the second piece of the evaluation is, okay, if it's deemed in the public interest, then are the costs reasonable and prudent? So you have the first kind of preliminary view of, is this a resource that would benefit ratepayers writ large? And then the second is, well, is this particular resource cost competitive? Are the costs reasonable? So there has been language in the past relative to specific resources, deeming them to be in the public interest. And that's typically what the legislature does. They say, this is in the public interest for a particular reason. Maybe it's economic development, maybe it's job creation, maybe it's providing diversification, resiliency. There are a whole variety of reasons why something can be deemed in the public interest. So Senate Bill 966 provided for 5,000 megawatts of utility scale solar and another 500 megawatts of rooftop solar deemed in the public interest. And actually, the 5,000 megawatts of utility scale, it's solar and wind, both onshore and the 12 megawatt offshore wind demonstration project. So that was the first time that we've included wind in the public interest determination language. Previous to that, the statute said 500 megawatts of solar deemed in the public interest. Dominion made a commitment as the previous legislation unfolded to move forward with that 500 megawatts through the previous administration's term. So now we're at 5,000, which is obviously a significant increase over where we were previously. There were other commitments relative to clean energy. The things that I think would be most important on the solar and wind energy side are additional areas of the Grid Transformation and Security Act that actually provided detail about how Dominion would procure those resources. So one piece of language said that the resources would be procured competitively, which means likely a request for proposals going out for the procurement of those resources. And then another provision of the code provided that 25% of both the 5,000 megawatt utility scale and the 500 megawatt rooftop would be through power purchase agreements. And we can spend a lot of time talking about power purchase agreements. There's a lot of nuance in the code and discussion at the State Corporation Commission relative to PPAs. But this language in Senate Bill 966 made clear that at least 25% of both the 5,000 utility scale and the 500 rooftop would be through power purchase agreements. So I know that that was something that the solar community had been working for quite some time to negotiate with the utilities. And then of course I don't want to leave our other investor-owned utility out, which is Appalachian Power Company. And there was specific language for Appalachian Power to move forward with 200 megawatts of solar in their service territory. Appalachian Power is situated a little bit differently than Dominion is because they're in an area that's seen very flat load growth. And I think it's been a bit more difficult for them to get some energy and capacity projects in their service territory. But still something that they recognize and want to prioritize going forward is trying to diversify their portfolio and get more of those resources on the books. All right, so that's Grid Transformation and Security Act. I won't dive too deeply into some of these other policy areas because I think it would be really helpful for us to have some Q&A, but I will say that as we're moving forward with the energy planning process, the energy plan is due on October 1st. So we've got a lot of drafts floating around internally. I hope to stay here with you guys for a little bit today, but I will be getting back to that work this afternoon. But there are obviously some other policy areas that we're looking at. We talked about net metering, community solar, PPAs, public-private partnerships, corporate procurement strategies, There certainly our own state renewable energy procurement targets, which we established some lead by example targets under the previous administration, and are looking at kind of ramping those up and elevating those targets in this administration, because we think that number one, the Commonwealth should be doing more, and number two, that there's a lot of benefit to us from a resilience perspective, but then also from an energy diversity perspective for us doing more. And then innovative financing programs. So I haven't really touched on those. There's some innovative financing programs that we were able to kick off under the previous administration, including PACE financing, our Virginia Saves program, which DMME oversees. But I think that there's a lot of opportunities to leverage both private and public capital in the next couple of years to really help to transform the landscape, and we're looking at a couple of different options within the administration. There have been a lot of conversations I mentioned about aggregation of projects, especially as we're thinking about corporate clean energy procurement, new tariff structures, what's going to happen at the State Corporation Commission. We have an open seat there, so I think there's just a lot of questions in terms of what the commission is going to do relative to these various filings before them. So there's a lot of interesting, I think, conversation going on in terms of the renewable energy space in Virginia, specifically a lot of it focused on solar energy. We hope to be at the forefront of that space, and we hope to see transformational progress over this governor's term. We've set some targets, and we'll be laying those out in our energy plan, so please stay tuned. It'll be released in the next couple of weeks, but we're really hoping to we've been able to kickstart the industry with your help and with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears of private developers, but we hope to really take it to the next level over the next 3.5 years, and look forward to working with all of you doing that. So with that, I don't know if you want to open it up for